Hello and welcome to Poetically Speaking. I'm Miriam E. Miles, poet and author of Phoenix and host of this little interview series. And I'm here today with David Tensen. David is passionate about helping individuals, families and organisations thrive. He is a public speaker, a writer and poet and consultant and trainer. And he works with people from business to leadership, helping them with emotional health and spiritual development. David is joining us from, I believe, the Sunshine Coast. Am I correct?
Correct, that's right.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, David. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
That's really good. Hopefully it's a bit sunnier where you are. It's a little dreary here today for us.
No, it's gorgeous. We're on holidays, so I had some time off work and study. So I took my boys to Mary Can Cross Park, which is in Mullaney in the hinterlands, and walked through the forest and had scones and jam and cream. So I've had a great morning.
I'm jealous already. Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, yeah, as we've had a little chat just before, it's really exciting to be able to interview you in regards to Poetically Speaking, and to hear your thoughts on the power of poetry in the 21st century. So the first thing I'd love to ask you is, what is it that inspires you to write poetry?
Yes, that is the magic question. I think life in general gives lots of opportunities. I started writing a few years ago, and before that, I spent a lot of time in kind of a healing ministry space. So some of those watching may know that space that I worked in. Previously, I traveled from 2013 to 2017, 18 inclusive,
Mm-hmm.
and did a lot of stuff in a healing, and a lot of stuff in just traveling. I traveled all over the world, and what I did a lot was spend time with people in a therapeutic capacity, and especially pastors and leaders and people going through tough seasons. And poetry became a way for me, after I'd hit the wall, a way for me to kind of document and reconcile and express things that were deep, things that had affected me, and thoughts on everything from God to life to empathy and emotions and a whole lot of stuff. So that's poetry is, first of all, to me, it's a therapy, it's a gift. And I started sharing it, and others are like, hey, that's me too. You've been living in my lounge room, get out. And so I thought, well, if it's a gift, I'll just keep offering it out there. And here we are, 2.5 years later.
Yeah. I noticed that in one of your poems, you mention, no, what was it? Maybe not one of your poems. Is that maybe something you put on social media about it being given? It's a gift that you like food being put on a table. Now I remember where it is. It was in our conversation on paper. That's why I couldn't remember. And I liked that analogy of putting food in front of people. The concept in my mind was like, it's not like people are being invited over for dinner and you know that you're going to sit down and eat, and so there's an expectation to eat. But it's like just laying food out on the coffee table, and just putting it there and not necessarily having to make any big deal about it. It's there if people want it, but if they don't have to have it. And I love how you said that it's one of those things that you don't have to be offended by if they choose not to. It's just there. And I really like that free-flowing kind of notion of letting your words float out onto the page for those who are ready to receive them, and not being too concerned about who receives them and how they receive them. Would that be a fair sort of response?
Yeah, that's right. I had it was I just turned 42,
mm-hmm.
and usually before my birthday I always just know I move, and my wife will attest to this. It's become a rhythm that we'll kind of have about 4 or 3 weeks of hardship, stuff will just really the tide will go out, and I always know that Holy Spirit wants to just reveal something to me, and this has been a faithful pattern. It's just a rhythm that I can tell years of stories on, and that the word offering came to me just before my birthday, and I was praying and with some friends, and it was just something that came to me, that idea of food, that it's put before people an offering. And both food is cooked. Fire can either burn or give warmth, and so it's this idea of offering. So that's why I wrote those 4 lines: this breath, an offering; these words, an offering; this life, an offering; this day is an offering. And so this idea of an offering, you like you said, you may not like it. So I think poetry, and I recalled watching your interview with Elizabeth too, it's just not everybody's taste.
Yeah.
You know, what the way that you write or I write may not be someone's taste. And like food that's given, it's like, hey, if you don't like it, that's cool. You know, as you said, it wasn't like you came to me starving and said, give me something I want. It's like, take it or leave it. So that was a freedom I needed to hear, because too often we give ourselves as sacrifices and give things sacrificially, trying to appease or please people. So this offering analogy, I think, is a lovely way to write and approach poetry, life, and everything that we do. It's an offering.
Do you find that having now taken that approach, that you feel more loosely tied to what you're writing? Like, that's not quite the way I want to explain it, but like, you know, that concept of letting something go and being comfortable with whatever occurs with it. Do you feel that having that mindset has made it easier for you to write and to release what you're writing?
I'm only kind of a week into that revelation. I know I'm waxing like it's been a long time. It was a long time coming, and I think that seed had been there for a while. I think, but a week on, it's good. It's made sense for other things in my life. It has made sense with food. I eat a little different than some of the other people in my family, and so you know, I cook for me and for my wife. We eat predominantly plant-based, whole food, plant-based food.
Yeah.
And the kids don't always like my curries or my salads. But one day, you know, my son goes, so, because it's on the table, I'll put some on my plate, you know. Dad, why have you never made this before? Well, I've been making it for 2 years, but so it works in other areas. It does help you. I hope it does help me hold things a lot looser, because if you let things go and fall to the ground, you never know what springs up. And then, not to say don't have expectations or dreams or hopes, but I think some things we hold too tightly. And if poetry is given as a gift and an offering, and if it blesses and sparks something in someone, then, you know, I kind of see myself a lot as a conduit, Miriam. Some of what I write is deeply personal, but some of what I write is deeply empathetic. It's not my story. I've sat as a witness to someone else's life or story or account or encounter or struggle or hardship, and just had the privilege of being able to put words to that. So it's not always me, you know, and those poems will first of all go to those people for a time, and there's some that I've given as gifts, as birthday gifts, as gifts through friends of hardship. There's a couple of poems that I wrote for a friend that lost his 19-year-old son late last year, all of a sudden, freak kind of brain aneurysm. So I wrote him. I remember sitting with him and having coffee, and he showed me a picture on his phone of his hand in his son's hand. and his son had the splint on for the, and this was in his son's last day, and he showed me on his phone in tears, and I was just deeply moved, and I got back into the car and I wrote a poem called Your Hand in Mine, and in tears, so for me it was like a cathartic release. So one of the reasons I don't do a lot of prayer ministry and therapy anymore, Miriam, is because my empathy and compassion is, like, of all the tests I've done, it's very high percentile.
Yeah.
So it makes you good at it, but it means it's limited.
Yeah.
And I never really have learnt the craft and art of people have been able to sit in those environments for hours and hours. I haven't been able to detach. So for me to sit, and as I think it says in, I don't know if it's Galatians or Colossians, that if we bear one another's burdens, we fulfill the law of Christ. I sat with my friend in the cafe that day, just a few weeks after he'd lost his son, and you bear that burden and you're able to put it into words as a gift.
Yeah.
And that's healing, that's that's healing for both of us.
There's a real universality in poetry that I find, is that someone right across the world in another whole other era of life can write something that hits me in such a way that I'm literally surprised by it. And like you said, there's that emotional connection with their journey that connects with my journey that I don't think other kinds of writing really, that it doesn't seem to have the same, the same ignition point,
Yeah.
And I think that, your story is a very universal one. I think if we talk to a large cohort of other poets, we'd find that many people are writing about things that they've experienced third hand, but that have touched them so deeply that their response becomes a universal response that then everybody else can experience as well and connect with their own story. So it's very powerful. Yeah,
it is very powerful,
and sometimes quite overwhelming.
Yeah, I can tell. I know the car park, the cafe, the car I was in. I just put this thing in my phone and sent it through to him that afternoon. There are these beautiful moments you get to participate in someone's journey. It's a great privilege. It's a deep privilege. It's a sacred privilege, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Something that you wrote when I was asking you questions was about a poet called David White. And you said that, and I quote, "Poetry is language against which we have no defense." I found that quite intriguing, and I'd love to hear a bit more about what that is like for you.
So David, I was listening to an On Being podcast in late 2018, and to give you some background, about 12 months earlier, I had to cancel all my appointments, pull off the road, off the circuit, off the speaking circuit, close my thing. I was just teaching and training, but I just hit burnout. I just hit a blocker, and it was. You always can, in hindsight, you always see the grace and goodness of God in these moments, but it was deeply difficult. And again, before my birthday, a number of things came up, and there were keys to unlock something for the next epoch in my life. And I was going for a walk, listening, and before that, I'd written a couple of poems. They were rhyming poems, which is fine, but I was listening to David White talk, and he was a friend and mentored by John O'Donoghue, another well-known poet. And I listened to him talking about friendship and generosity, and he read a poem from that, and then some prose, and it just sparked. It was a supernatural thing, you know. It just struck a chord, we can use that language, and resonated. And I just came home and wrote, and we had a family holiday, much needed family holiday, gifted to us on the Gold Coast, and I think I wrote like 5 or 6 poems in the 3 days we were away.
Yeah.
And that I haven't stopped since.
Wow.
So I don't think David White would be watching, but I with gratitude to Krista Tippett and David White and those in that space, and since have discovered other people, Padraig or Tuma, other beautiful poets, Jericho Brown. There's a whole lot, of course, Mary Oliver, but poetry was really not a large part of my time up to that. And so what I love about it is you can write something. Understand too, another hat that I wear is I think, as you mentioned, I'm an honours year student hoping for a PhD, so I'm neck deep in research, and you've got to defend what you say in research. You know, you have to. That's the craft. The craft is to write and persuade and argue and stay objective, but not with poetry. It's subjective and it's an offering. And if you don't agree, I don't care. You know, like I don't have to defend my interpretation. I don't have to defend what I've written. It is what it is. No one looks at a Picasso and goes, I absolutely disagree. Like, it's not, you don't do that, you know. But in prose and research and everything else, there is a sense of defense. And in the offering that poetry is, there's no defense. And that kind of appeals to me, because I'm not a huge fan of conflict. I'm leaning and learning, and some of my poetry reflects that. But I just love that kind of idea that it has no defense, needs no defense. And I love how C.S. Lewis talked about, you know, hearing the gospel story and then wanting to write an imaginative story, as he did in his books. And he says, you know, I needed to write something, and I might be misquoting him here, but that would kind of sneak past sleeping dragons. So that's the cognitive mind, and poetry has this way of just getting right into your living room, right into the deep chambers of your heart, and it can take your breath away. And sometimes you're gifted with. I get about an email a month now from someone saying, hey, often they've heard Paul Young read some of my poetry and said, you've been living in my house. I can't believe you've just put to words what I've known.
Yeah.
You know, and that's all. I haven't created a special note. I've just had the privilege of strumming that tone for that time, for that person's life. And
that to me, that is the crux of the power of poetry, especially in this day and age where we have this incredible interconnectedness across the world, where we can, in seconds, we can speak into somebody else's life. We can press publish, and someone can immediately see that and have an incredible response to it. And to me, there's a power in that we have an opportunity to tap into like no other time in history, especially in this time where the world is so in absolute chaos. And it's so exciting to hear that people are responding to you in that way. And to me, that just shows that the link between when we speak out what we believe through such a creative mode, we are actually creating an opportunity for people to respond to that and to grow themselves through that as well, or at least be encouraged.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I can write something and have it at the world's in their hands in moments. I mean, this is stuff that you do hear about poets who didn't publish till their later years or till their death, you know. but for us, there's opportunity now. And I think probably some of the best poetry and stories are unpublished. I think they're written. People have just not pressed send or go. And we're given that great opportunity now to do that. And yeah, it's true. It's an amazing time of the speed of delivery. I think what is a little bit of a shame about that, and I think it's a lovely thing about printing something, is, and a friend of ours, Anne Hamilton, who is my wife's co-written a few books with, and has written quite a number of books herself. She says that printed books find people. In a way that digital books and digital media doesn't, because you could be, and I don't know how many stories you've heard like this. I mean, I can tell you, I was, before I wrote that, heard that David White thing, I remember being at a book exchange in our local little town here in Caloundra. I was with my boys. We had some time to kill before we watched a movie. And I went in and I saw a book of Australian poetry, and it was like a poetry textbook. Lovely thick thing. I've never bought any poetry, and I walked in and it was there, and I looked, had some Banjo Patterson, and I'm like, oh yeah, put it away. And I just felt this tug to say, just buy the book. And in my own mind, I'm thinking, oh yeah, it's a textbook, it's $4, it's probably worth $20 because it's a recent. I'm going to put it on eBay and make some money. Of course it didn't sell. And but books find you, so to print something, you never know where it'll end up. In a book exchange, somebody can hand you something, and it doesn't die off as quick. I think sometimes I write a poem, and some people will notice this if they follow me on social media. I'll write something and publish it. They're like, that's beautiful. I wrote that 18 months ago, but they think you just wrote it now. And like, this is your latest. No, that's old. If you look on the date, it's written September 2018.
Yeah.
So I think it's lovely to be able to do both if you can.
Yeah, I love the fact that poetry has no expiry date.
It doesn't. No, I mean, I think some does, but generally it doesn't. And if it does have an expiry, it doesn't have an expiry date. Sometimes it is timely, right? Yes. It is. Yeah. It is about poetry about COVID. Won't sell in 2 years' time, but it will be a page in history people can reference.
Exactly. Yeah. So, what was it? There was another question I was going to ask you. I just got written down. Sometimes my brain can't remember everything. Can yours? So
one thing I was going to mention was a huge blessing. We talk about stuff where things land. I was at some dear friends of mine in Melbourne, and who were hosting William Paul Young, who wrote The Shack, and they were hosting him for a conference weekend. I wasn't up to preaching or teaching, but Gary and Debbie are friends, and they said, come on down, you can stay at our house. And so I got to hang out with Gary and Paul Young as well, who's just a beautiful human and a loveliest guy. And during one of the meetings, my friend said to me, oh, look, I know you said you wouldn't speak, but could you
set up
close in prayer or say a blessing? And I was like, okay. I wasn't, feeling fantastic, but I wrote this blessing. It's called The Blessing for the Heart Journey. And I wrote it on the spot, and then I read it. And Paul said, can I have that? And what else have you written? And so anytime I write something, I give it to Paul, and it's he's been a huge advocate, and there's hardly a YouTube or a conference video that he doesn't share one of my pieces, because he just says I can climb into them. And I remember the first time hearing him read one of my pieces, I did cry, because to hear somebody else who's a generation on, who's been through hell, who's traveled the world, who's written one of the best-selling novels of in the last century in Christendom, I was like, wow, and so it has encouraged me to keep writing, but you never know where it lands.
It's like you ended up with a mentor that you weren't expecting to have.
Correct. Yeah, he's been a great help in a lot of things, and said to me, David, we have to publish, we have to build a collection. You've got to. I remember an email come through. So, when are you going to write a book? I don't know. Can you help? Yep, I'll help you. When are we going to do it? So we've got something in the pipeline.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about that if you can. I think you've said it's called The Wrestle.
That's my working title. I haven't
To be
published anything kind of really big like this before. From what I hear is you have your working title, and the publishing house, if you're fortunate enough, to get something or someone decent, say, we don't like that title. So it's called The Wrestle, which is the name of one of the poems in there, and it kind of is it was written in a time and for a lot of people going through wrestling with God and stages of faith and stages of crises, and that's where I've spent a lot of my time in the ministry and helping and healing spaces, people who have these big wrestles with God, and so that people will see that thread in things that I write that are faith-based. They'll see this goes just so raw and honest, and because I was faced with that off the glamour of the Sunday stage, to sit with weeping pastors and leaders who are dying inside and wondering how they're going to make it through another week.
Yeah.
You can't do the smoke and mirrors. You have to write authentically, and so that's why that's some of the flavor of it, and why this one's called The Wrestle. And so it's kind of from the story of Jacob in the valley of Jabbok.
Yeah.
Good play on words there.
And when are you hoping to publish that?
Well, the manuscript is with an agent and is being sent out. I did get some news that it's with somebody being considered.
Yeah. But
I'm also told it just takes a while. And again, it's an offering. It's an offering to publishers who think I'm keen, and so I've got somebody generously looking after that for me as well, which is a blessing. So some of them are published. If people go to my blog, they'll be able to find some, but there's a number that aren't as well. And plus it's a collection. It's good to have them all together.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. I certainly will be looking forward to hearing when it is imminent to publish, so that we can
I'll let you know.
Update the interview and let people know what's going on there. Would you mind reading one of your poems for us from your collection?
Yeah, I can read this one called The Wrestle.
Awesome.
All right, here we are. The Wrestle. I found you beyond the why, far from the why not, worlds from why me. You held a space for me beyond answers to questions my pain had, as if you knew information was never going to heal or resolve or fix my suffering. Instead, you agreed to wrestle through many nights, never letting go, always with me, just like you promised. Refusing to surrender, I eventually realized that wrestling with God was not a crime, that I was, in fact, being healed, being held, being transformed by finding you beyond answers, being blessed by holding on to you in my doubt and frustration and never letting go. And you never let go. And you overcame me in the end, and we both won.
Wow. Oh, I love how you said that wrestling with God is not a crime. I think that's initially that's the line that really just throws itself out at me and says, you know, he knows us. He knows what we're going to go through, and he knows how we're going to manage it, and he knows he's strong enough to help us in that wrestle.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I love it.
Yeah. And for you, that's the pain. That's the line, right? Some people go, "Oh, that line."
Yeah.
There's always something in a poet in a piece of poet. I just remember the opening line to Mary Oliver's Wild Geese,
Mm.
and it's just one line, and the opening line is, "You do not have to be good."
Oh.
And it's really simple, but you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk through the desert for 1,000 miles on your knees repenting. You only have to allow the soft animal of your body to love what it loves. Something like that. But the opening line is, you do not have to be good. And sometimes it's like a permission, because we like to be good as Christians. But what it means is, you don't have, you are good, and you actually are good by virtue of your humanity in Christ. If you're in him, you can't be anything but good and loved and accepted. So but there's a journey to being able to recite that, and a bigger journey to be able to walk in that ontologically, that it's really who you are. So wrestling with God. What I love about this picture of wrestling, Miriam, is this idea that you're always being held. Like, there is nothing more visceral and intimate. Like, it's the next closest thing is sex to wrestling. Like, that's it.
Oh.
And if we have that picture of God wrestling, of this angel of the Lord wrestling with Jacob, or us in our wrestling, we're always being held and being healed. We want intimacy, but we don't want to wrestle. It's like, I want sex, but I don't want to touch you. Like, there is this, no, these things are synonymous. The wrestling is the intimacy, and God always holds a space for us beyond answers to questions our pain has, and as if he knew information was not enough.
That is profound, David. That is profound. Wow, I'm really looking forward to it now. Actually, I'm quite a fan of poetry that rips the band-aid off and forces all the stuff out, so that I have to look at it. I have to face it, and
there's lots of that in there.
Yeah,
there's a lot in there like that.
Yeah. So if there was one thing that you could say to poets who are up and coming, who are just starting to reach out into the poetry medium, what piece of advice would you give them to encourage them?
What helped me was to find some poets to begin with whose rhythm and style just resonates with you.
Yeah.
And read it aloud, and feel the rhythm, feel that stuff. I know I've only been writing poetry since kind of late 2018, but I've been writing and blogging for years.
Yeah.
So I just didn't know it would translate so well into the conciseness of poetry. So I think just keep writing, get up and write. There's some great writers workshops on YouTube that have assumed things like this, where somebody will give you prompts, writing prompts, and just exercise and practice and put it out there. And if you don't want to put it on social media, just find a few friends or start a little group and say, hey, can I send you these? I will write one and send the draft off to Paul or to a couple of friends. And I'm not after critique, because they'll never do it, but you both know if something's gone. You'll know when something's that really resonates, and there's a couple lines that even catch you by surprise. I think this is this wonderful thing about poetry and wisdom writing, is that it have a pen and paper or your phone or a notebook, something nearby, and even if it's a line.
Yeah.
You know, my wife said something the other day and I wrote it down because I thought that's just really, we say it all the time, but I've never really thought about what you mean by that. And so I just write that down and it may spark something off. So
I totally agree with you. I think there's been times for myself where I know you mentioned earlier where when that spark occurred for you, it was like it unleashed, it unlocked a box full of words that you were able to put together, and you know, in a way that you hadn't done before. And I find that for myself as well, and other poets that I speak to, there's these seasons where the words just fly out at speed, and all you can do is just try and capture them all, and hope that you can find something in that collection that becomes, you know, a poem. And I think it's really important for young poets, or for, you know, poets regardless of age, but, you know, young in the process of writing poetry, to write everything and not to worry about how good it is or how sellable it is or how, you know, engaging it is, but to write it for the sake of writing it. As you mentioned before, there's pieces where they will never see the light of day because they are part of my personal growth process, that writing them was actually about me getting healing in that experience. And they're poetic, but they're not going to be poetic for other people to experience. They're part of my personal journey. And from then, other stuff tends to come out that is more universal for other people. So
exactly.
Yeah.
I'd echo that. Write for you first.
Yes.
Write because you enjoy it. Write as a therapy. Yeah.
Agreed. Was there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience today before we finish up?
I think we've talked about a lot of stuff. Watch this space. You'll put all my details if people want to find my poetry, and I'm good.
Excellent.
Thanks for making space for me.
Oh, look, it's been a genuine pleasure, and thank you for being able to connect so last minute, because, you know, that's how I work. Yes, we will definitely put all of your social media on the blog post, and on behalf of the growing and Poetically Speaking audience, I thank you very much for your time. Everybody, thank you so much for watching and listening to David Tensen and myself speak about the power of poetry in the 21st century. If you would like to know more, please definitely check out the blog post with all of the social media links and information about David's work that he does. Let us know if there's anything you'd like to know, and I'm sure David would be happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much, and signing off. See you later.